You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Welcome to the Climate Conversations. I'm your host, Julie Yoo. Now, today, our focus is on the impact stemming from the resurgence of global travel. Post-pandemic, travelers can essentially go anywhere they want, generally with no restrictions. But this freedom brings with it some serious baggage. We're talking about over-tourism, the not-so-friendly impact on our planet when popular destinations get swarmed with visitors. The numbers are staggering. Travel alone contributes a hefty 10 to 11% of greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2030, we're looking at 1.8 billion tourists annually. That's an enormous carbon footprint in plane tickets and travel-sized shampoo bottles. To help us navigate this eco-dilemma, CNA's Dawn Tan delved into this issue in a 3-part series on green travel, and she's here with us now with some insight. Dawn, great to have you on the show, especially since our schedules rarely align.
Thanks for having me, Julie.
Thanks for joining me today. So Dawn, on to the topic at hand, travel. It's often seen as an escape, a getaway, a chance to leave it all behind, but that's not the whole story, right? Lately, we've been seeing the emergence of what's termed over-tourism in certain tourist destinations. So let's unpack that. What's this over-tourism all about, and what does it have to do with climate change?
Well, here's the thing, Julie. When it comes to travel, some places in the world just stand out, right? I mean, we all want to go to certain places. People have this so-called bucket list, the places they have to go to. You know, who's going to go to Paris, for example, and not go to the Eiffel Tower? Or if you're going to Venice, you have to go to the Piazza San Marco. So for over-tourism, it's kind of like places that many people want to go see. Unfortunately, too many at the same time. And of course, we had the pandemic,
Right.
So the numbers have just crept up as we suspected they would. But over-tourism is a term that really came about at least 10 years ago. It wasn't post-pandemic. It's something that we started to be concerned about because we started to see not only that more people were going, but what the impact was. So the impact in a place like San Marco Square or at the Eiffel Tower, that's in a city, right? But imagine what the impact might be like if there's more footfall in places of nature. In places where there is fragile biodiversity. The impact is going to be even more.
And social media has a lot to do with this, right? It's like a megaphone or a giant billboard for promoting destinations. How is this playing a part?
Well, social media has played this huge role more in the last 10 to 15 years. It has pushed the idea that these places are even more accessible. It used to be just talking to someone after they went on a holiday and you'd look at their pictures and say, hey, that looks really nice. Now you don't even need to know the person in order to see somebody else's huge range of cool places that they've been to. And immediately the seed gets planted in your mind and you're like, hey, I have a vacation coming up. That's where I want to go next. But as a result of that sort of shortened runway, we're making those decisions quickly. The impact of that is on places that may not be ready for the number of people that are going to arrive. I spoke to a number of people in the series that I was developing, and one in particular was senior tourism specialist Wouter Schalken from the Asian Development Bank. And he spoke to me about this, so I think we can have a listen.
Every individual social media outlet has become a promotional entity. So all of a sudden there's influx of visitation to specific sites for which these sites and areas were never capacitated to deal with. And I think that's a huge issue. And we see that being repeated in many countries. Even some of the countries who dealt with it before are seeing some of those trends occurring. And others are sneaking up to situations that can have the same kind of level of impact.
So that's the problem. There is this distinct lack of solutions based on data, and you couple that with the challenges that are faced by these destinations in even just conceptualizing this long-term plan to control tourism growth. That's the goal. But it also has to have a focus on the quality of life for the people who actually live there.
So how are some of these popular destinations coping with the surge, Dawn?
So much is being done, Julie. I mean, if you think about Boracay from years ago, the lack of adequate infrastructure coupled with this huge surge of people wanting to go stay there, that caused then President Rodrigo Duterte to close the place down. I mean, he declared famously, said that Boracay was a cesspool. I mean, the reason for that was because raw sewage in some areas was being pumped straight into the sea. So we had radical changes there. The government demolished some hotels that were too close to the beach, restaurants that were on the beach, they got shut down. It started to control. Boracay as a destination decided to control the number of tourists coming in. Elsewhere, Japan, as an example, post-pandemic, it's just soared in terms of popular. Right? And I think part of that's just because of the value of the currency, right? But they too have had to try to control numbers. Places like Kyoto that are very popular, they've got a tourism tracker. They actually monitor the number of people who come in, what time they go there, and when they come back, so how long they actually spent at a time. So if you're going to Kyoto, you can actually look at this platform and see the density of tourists who are there. So that might change your mind as to whether you're going to go to a particular hotspot or not.
Wow, sounds like this isn't confined to one country, but really it's a global phenomenon, Dawn. So sustainable travel, sustainable tourism. I don't think many of us are sufficiently familiar with what it actually means. Based on your research and talking to people, what is it exactly?
The thing about travel is you don't want to have too much by way of responsibility. You don't think about that. I mean, secretly, maybe privately, we just want to switch off. We just want to throw caution to the wind, maybe even. It's like living another life, like getting into another skin, right? So the last thing, in a way, I mean, let's call it like it is. The last thing you want to be told is, have you calculated your carbon footprint?
Exactly, Dawn.
Yeah, so I can be honest with you and tell you I've never calculated my carbon footprint for a trip. Okay, for January to December in my daily life, I've done that. I kind of know what it is, and I have tried to mitigate it and so on. But for travel, this is something that is beginning to happen in a niche way. But we've got actually some statistics by a company called GWI. They're a data analytics company, and before I talk to you about just what sustainable travel is, I wanted you to have a listen to what this particular data analytics company says about the trends that they're seeing. Bear in mind, they track like 1 million people across the Asia Pacific alone every year as to what the younger generation feel about green travel. Have a listen.
Nature vacations are increasingly becoming at the top of the list for Gen Zs and millennials. Unfortunately, we are seeing people who say that they have concern for the environment dropping year on year, but that's along with a lot of other interest data points in our study. I think it's mostly due to everything that's been happening around. Our study has shown that across over 50 interest data points, most of the interests are dropping, and unfortunately, concern in environmental issues is one of them. That's not to say that consumers are apathetic about their environment, but it's definitely taking up less of their headspace with everything that's been going around the world.
So there you go, Julie. Young people want to travel to places of nature, but it doesn't mean that they care about being eco-conscious when they get there. I mean, that was like the penny dropped when I heard that statistic. I was like, why? But you know what? The pandemic had something to do with it. According to what GWI has seen, they said that trend of wanting to see places of nature, the FOMO, like I didn't get to see it before, now I really want to see it. They don't necessarily care about being eco-conscious when they see it because of that feeling that they want to take care of themselves. Because of the pandemic, that feeling that, hey, anything could happen, people could die here, let's just go for it, that also had a corresponding sort of growth. So wanting to take care of oneself and just experience all the good stuff. Will that taper off? Maybe it will. It's still early days.
I mean, whether that pace is swift or gradual, so it appears that the travel sector is poised for these significant transformation, right? How are they evolving, and what sort of financial implications might arise from these?
Well, the transformation is gathering pace. In a way, it doesn't matter what you and I do to be green, to be sustainable, because to be a sustainable traveler means so many things. A climate scientist that I interviewed, Professor Winston Chow, said it's not good enough to just take your bamboo toothbrush on holiday with you and say, okay, I'm sustainable. It's good. It's a start. You can take that metal drinking straw, not accept, to use any plastic straws when you're on a trip. The small things are very important, but it's the really big things,
Right.
the infrastructure that's changing. And when you talk to aviation specialists and they talk about sustainable aviation fuels and so on, there is progress in the aviation sector, in the hospitality sector as well. That is gathering pace and it's making a difference, but it's going to take a lot of money to do, because really what we're doing is unpicking the threads of the way in which the travel sector has the foundation that it's been built on, and saying, let's just redo all of this so that it is green, so that we're using renewable energy sources, so that we are reducing, reusing, recycling, we're doing all of that, but let's amp it up if we're really going to tip this sector over and make it as green as possible. Now, the sustainable part of it that comes in is really what I mentioned before, which is even if you go to a destination and you interact with businesses, they don't always have to be the spa or, the restaurant that is catering to a tourist. It can be other things as well, right? So there are many people in this sector who have nothing to do with tourism. How can your visit actually help that community so that they're paying the opportunity cost of you coming to their home, basically. How do I manage myself as a guest going to the home of another person who didn't invite me for dinner, basically? So that's what sustainable tourism really is.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. And Donna, in making the series, was there any particular organization or an individual who has taken the lead in this respect that really stood out for you?
Yeah, one startup that stood out for me was this company called Big Tiny. In the series, I interviewed the co-founder, Julie Yoo, and this is a company that has hundreds of these tiny houses all over the world, specifically Australia, but they never had any in Singapore, and it's a Singapore startup. So during the pandemic, they thought, since no one can go anywhere, how about we try and encourage the government to try putting 5 of these cabins on an island somewhere. They thought about doing this in Bukit Timah, somewhere on the mainland at first. Didn't work out. So what they got? Lazarus Island. So they set up these 5 little cabins, and they have become so popular, Julie. Even up until March next year, I think they're fully booked out. That's because they are green, they are made of sustainable materials, they are about as green as it possibly can get.
So what sort of specific eco-friendly features are we talking about?
100% solar powered, as an example. So they've got, does it have air conditioning? I know you're thinking that, right? Yeah, everyone thinks. I went to stay for one night, and that was the first thing on my mind. I was like, this place is going to be hot. And there was an air conditioner in there. They've never had to tap on the power grid. There are solar panels on every roof of these eco cabins that are designed specifically to be green, and they can power the fridge, they can power the air conditioning and the lighting system as well, plus television.
What a treat. So
Yeah.
water, resources, waste management, how are they handling that?
Yeah, this is a good question. All of the waste from the island is collected and it's sorted back on the mainland by vendors who then reduce, they recycle the waste, whatever waste is generated from those 5 eco cabins as well.
Okay.
But as Julie Yoo told me, they are continually trying to find new ways to kind of be sustainable. So as an example, you can order a pre-packaged meal from Big Tiny, to be delivered to you. Sort of, it's in your cabin already. It's kind of frozen. That packaging is not green. And I was asking them about that. They said, okay, that's the next one. So there's always more that can be done.
Step by step.
Yeah.
But do visitors genuinely enjoy their time at these facilities? Because it's important that sustainability doesn't make it feel like a chore. How do they ensure the guests have an enjoyable and engaging time?
Well, the thing about the tiny away houses is that during the pandemic, it became an opportunity for Singaporeans to just kind of go on a staycation. So come on, it's 7 kilometers away from Sentosa, but it feels far enough away. And the thing is that when you get there, Julie, the island, it's just you. It's just you and 5 other people in those other cabins. That's it. And I think it's because they specifically want to get away from it all. So in a way, when I was there, I saw people bringing their dogs and they bring their tent. So they will sort of camp on the beach. And it does feel like you're getting away from it all, from the bustle of Singapore.
And local communities, too, have a role to adapt to the conservation of popular tourist destinations, which really often play a key part in the economy. You visited the foothills of the Indian Himalayas at one of India's oldest parks that are struggling with over-tourism. What did you learn from there?
Well, Corbett National Park is India's oldest protected forest. And within it, there is the Corbett Tiger Reserve, which is one of the last places that you can really see the Bengal tiger. India itself is home to 90% of the world's last remaining wild tigers. But these tiger reserves that are in India just constitute about 2.4% of forests that is protected in India. There is only about 5% forest left in India that is protected. But to put it into context about the conflict that we're seeing, even without putting one tourist in a national park in India or in a tiger reserve, there are around 3 million people that live in India's national parks. So these are people that just live there. They have nothing to do with tourism. That's their home. So the thing about sustainable tourism there is that it really puts into context that if you're visiting a place like that, your presence is impacting not just the wildlife, but also the people who live there. They farm it. Typically, they will farm the land there. But they also are paying the opportunity cost for the tourism sector that is built around those national parks. And just to very quickly sum it up for you, Julie, about why it's so important to understand the correlation between a growing tourism sector and climate change here, and why sustainable tourism is an answer to that, is that when it comes to forests, we know those are the world's lungs, and we need to protect those forests. That's a good idea, but the people who live in those forests are really like the anchor points, or like the kind of the nails that keep the whole thing together, and none more so than the big animals, the apex predators that are within those forests. So if the presence of tigers alone, if we protect the tigers, right, then we are indirectly protecting the forests as well. You know, if you cut down the forest, the tigers lose their home too. So the effort to protect tigers or elephants or any large animal that lives in a forest is also kind of mitigating the speed at which we're seeing climate change.
So you've touched on all different sides, the local communities, the private sector, and individuals trying to make a change. It seems like it's a whole of society job, as it's often with climate change and sustainability challenges. So there's still a lot to accomplish here to make travel truly green and sustainable. So what can typical traveler do to begin that journey in a meaningful way?
Well, everything that you do when you're on a vacation, right? Everything has some kind of impact. Everything has an emission, and we're discovering that that is true whether we're on holiday or not. And this is thankfully something that is slowly creeping into what we do, right? So we want to avoid fast fashion. At least we're thinking about it. It's not something we used to think about before. The same is true for being a tourist. Can I slow things down a little bit here? Can I put FOMO aside a little bit and just literally not have this tick-off list where I have to pack in as much as possible on my trip? Can I just slow things down so that I'm able to better appreciate the place that I'm going to? Just remember that thing that I said about being a guest in someone's home. And how would I conduct myself if I went to that home? I'd want to observe. I might want to hear their story rather than constantly wanting to create a new story for myself. And kind of social media does that, right? We want to reinvent ourselves. We need to turn this whole thing on its head a little bit when it comes to travel and put ourselves into the shoes of the people whose homes we're entering.
I just love how it boils down to mindfulness and how small adjustments can collectively make a difference. Dawn, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. I hope these insights prompt us to make more conscious choices for our next trips.
It's been great to be with you, Julie.
My thanks to Dawn and to our listeners. We hope you enjoy this episode and learned something about sustainable travel. The team behind this podcast is Tiffany Ang, Sian Win, Joanne Chan, and Crispina Robert. Till we meet again next week, I'm Julie Yoo.